Welcome. I'm Jim Falk, and I'm so glad you could join us as we talk about a highly controversial and emotional topic, campus protests over the war in Gaza. In response to encampments on the grounds of now over 130 campuses, we've seen commencements canceled, modified, all over the country. Guest speakers were disinvited, and buildings have been occupied and sometimes even vandalized. Reportedly, 2,700 protesters, mostly students, have been arrested, suspended, and there have also been reports of faculty who have expressed pro-Palestinian views not having their contracts renewed. In defense of their right to protest, demonstrators refer to the First Amendment of our Constitution. Others argue that there are limits, and universities have the obligation and the right to put student safety first. To discuss these issues and what we might expect once classes resume in the fall, let's meet our two experts. I'm pleased to welcome here in our studio Jeremi Suri. He's a frequent guest on the program who usually comes to us from Austin, where he's professor of history at the University of Texas. Dr. Suri is the author and editor of 11 books on politics and foreign policy, and is the host of a great weekly podcast, This is Democracy. Jeremi witnessed firsthand the protest and arrest which took place on the UT campus. Also joining us is Paul Watler. He's an attorney and partner with Jackson Walker here in Dallas, and he's a nationally recognized expert in First Amendment law. His law degree is from the University of Texas at Austin. Great to have you both here, especially in the studio.
Thank you, Jim.
It's great to be here.
So it can't be easy to be a professor or university administrator now, but universities have been bedeviled about how to handle protests for a very, very long time. And one of the universities that was forward acting in this a number of years ago, I think it was back in the 60s, probably in response to the Vietnam War, was the University of Chicago. Jeremi, tell us about that.
So the University of Chicago came up with a set of principles that the University of Texas and many other universities have adopted. And these are principles that protect free speech, but also provide certain very outer limits on how free speech can be expressed based on time, place, and manner. And so the point of these principles that I'm sure we'll talk about in more detail is that one should be able to voice dissident views, even offensive views, because often the offensive views are an important input in our discussion. And what's offensive today might not be offensive tomorrow. But there are legitimate limits on particular times, places, and manners for the purposes of the university functioning and for the purposes of the university staying neutral. The university should not have a position.
And that's a key word,
yes.
Neutrality on this, right?
Correct. And so as an example, I think we would all agree that students should have the right to protest and express strong opinions on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side. But time, place, and manner restrictions would allow a university to say that you cannot express those opinions in a way that prevents students from taking their exams.
Now, you used the word students, but one of the things about the Kelvin, right?
Exactly.
Who was a great First
Chicago.
Amendment scholar
Exactly.
like you. All right. So that was also pertaining to the university taking positions.
Correct. And I think one of the important roles of a university is to be a home for all points of view, not to make our universities pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. In fact, we want our universities to draw people in from all points of view. It's very hard, though, because there often are moral pressures. Think about after the George Floyd murder, right? Many universities were pressured to take a position. Most of us would say we believe universities should be against brutality towards any group. But nonetheless, if a university takes a position on that, it necessarily privileges one point of view over another. The Kelvin principles are designed to discourage any privileging of one point of view over another.
But they would take positions. And Paul, that's sort of a change now with what we're seeing with Harvard, which I think announced this early in the summer.
When Harvard, in dealing with campus protests this past spring, they took the approach, rather than calling in police to actually arrest or shut down an encampment and that sort of thing, that they suspended the students that were involved in the protests rather than actually having them arrested. They also ultimately reached agreement with the protesters, the student group, that the student group would take down the encampment in return for the university agreeing to have a discussion with the students about disinvestment. There was criticism brought by the students, and this recurs in many campus settings, that the university should disinvest its endowment funds from things that are associated with Israel. And Harvard made no commitments that would actually be done, but that there would be dialogue in return for shutting down or disassembling the encampment, if you will.
Well, that's how Harvard handled the protests. But Harvard also, just a few weeks ago, came out with a new policy, which I think is somewhat controversial. It took people by surprise. And that was that they would no longer take positions on behalf of the university on some of these political issues, such as Ukraine. Am I explaining that right?
Yes, I think so, and I think it's building on the Kelvin principles. It's taking it to a new level. The principles presumed, at least as they were applied until recently, that you wouldn't take positions on politically controversial issues, but there were certain values you would articulate that did have a political valence to them. So every university, after again the George Floyd incident, every university articulated a defense of diversity. Right. And a defense of multiculturalism in one form or another. Now Harvard is saying, and I think other universities are going to say, we're going to scale that back as well because of the perception, whether real or not, that it's privileging one point of view.
There's been some criticism of universities adopting these neutrality policies that do harken back to the Professor Calvin at the University of Chicago and principles that he enunciated 50 years or more ago. And but some people view that this is sort of the university giving itself a pass, trying to stay on the sidelines of controversial issues. And, a number of people expect universities to take more forceful stances on what they view to be particular moral values or particular universal principles. And yet some people perceive that Harvard, for instance, may be backing away from that sort of participation in the discourse.
I think people are definitely doing that. What about UT? Here you have, and I want to really focus on this in a bit, about the difference between a public and a private university. But while we're talking about principles, what is the UT principle now?
So generally the UT principle is that the university will not take a position on issues, and that we will, at least rhetorically, defend free speech at almost all costs, but we will enforce our rules on where you can speak and how you can encamp or not encamp and the ways in which one should comport oneself on campus. So the position of the university is you can shout pretty much whatever you want to shout, but you cannot block a building. You cannot have an encampment. And when police were brought onto campus on April 24th and April 29th, the justification for that was not that the protesters were shouting Free Palestine, but instead that they were planning to build, they had not built them yet, but that they were planning to build encampments and stay overnight on the green. And that is against university rules. It's actually against Austin City rules as well. And so that's the justification that was used there.
So, Paul, what restrictions are the difference between public and private universities? I mean, does Rice in Houston handle this differently than, say, UT at Dallas?
Most private universities these days have basically adopted policies that do ensure that students have the right to exercise their First Amendment rights on campus and in campus settings. So they've kind of like just agreed to follow First Amendment principles, but they still have a lot more leeway than a public university. Public university is a state actor, is a governmental entity, and the First Amendment does apply to their rules and regulations and activities. And Jeremi very much enunciated the line, that is that students and people on the campus do have the right to speak freely, do have the right to advocate strongly, including principles that some people find offensive. I mean, that is the idea of the First Amendment, is to protect expressions that the majority may find offensive. But nonetheless, we tolerate them in the interests of civic discourse. But the line sort of ends at the point where it progresses from just expressive activity to activity that is criminal or disruptive or harassment or constituting threats or incitement to violence.
And it's really in the eye of the beholder. I mean, who's making these decisions?
It can be very difficult to draw those lines, and particularly some of the sloganeering that goes along with these campus protests focused on the Hamas and the Palestinian issue, where does that speech cross the line to anti-Semitism, to speech that might be cause for being prohibited or regulated or in some sense shut down? One of the main principles under the First Amendment in this area is that although, say, universities as state actors, public universities are entitled to have reasonable time, place, manner regulations of speech activities.
And that makes, I hear what you're saying, reasonable time, place, but take a minute and just sort of elaborate on that.
And let me just add, but that is to be content neutral. It is not directed to viewpoint. It is viewpoint neutral, or should be. And so when you start trying to say, we need to shut down these campus protests because they're becoming we don't like their message about Palestinians and about Palestinian liberation and that sort of thing. That's more from a content or a viewpoint regulation, or a sense that the message is not acceptable. So it's not a question, and time, place, manner only allows when you can protest, where you can protest, the manner of protest, which is basically peacefully in a non-disruptive way. So the First Amendment protects speech. It doesn't protect conduct. So when the conduct becomes, say, encampments or blocking passages or occupying buildings, that's conduct. That's not pure speech. The First Amendment protects speech and not those sorts of conduct that might cross over to criminal conduct or at least conduct that's unacceptable.
And that's another fine line.
These are complex issues, but they can also be simplified very logically, right? We want to encourage students to express themselves. We want them to be engaged. We want them to be bringing different points of view onto campus. We want to hear conservative points of view. We want to hear far left points of view. But everyone on campus should be able to conduct their daily lives and their daily work, whether they want to listen or not want to listen. And so most campuses have pretty obvious places where people can stand and shout. At UT, it's the South Mall, which is basically between the Capitol and the Tower and between what we call the six-pack of academic buildings. I teach right over there in Garrison Hall. It's a grass space. People can stand there and shout, and students can walk around it. They can go into class. That's what was happening on April 24th. In fact, the students were out there protesting Free Palestine. I was teaching a class. I didn't even know they were out there till class was over. I accidentally ran into the protest. That is fine, it seems to me. Mm-hmm. Once those words, whatever they are, now become part of a disruptive activity, if that were to be the case, if they were to prevent me from getting into my office or barge into my office, that would seem to me to be a violation.
Part of the reason that
universities... Which we've seen at Stanford and some of the others.
Exactly. I think that's where we have to draw the line.
Exactly, and so time, place, manner regulation is aimed at the sort of the things that Jeremi is bringing up here, and that is that, yes, you can have free speech and have it exercised on campus, but still the university's mission is to educate and conduct classes and confer degrees and engage in research, and when that
we've all paid tuition.
That's right.
Exactly.
And so when that those First Amendment activities start to be disruptive of that, or where students feel harassed or intimidated so that they're essentially denied their educational opportunity because they're in fear of going on campus and being harassed or being pointed out.
Let me ask you this, gentlemen. I have the feel, and I haven't been on a campus during the last few months, that this issue over Gaza is being handled differently than, say, Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. Am I wrong there?
No, you're absolutely right. It's being handled very differently, and it disturbs me.
Why? Not why it disturbs you, but how is it being handled?
Well, I think I'll comment from the perspective of Texas, and I think this is true for other states, but it's particularly true here. I think there are certain politicians who have seen it as advantageous to defend what they see as those who are suffering from anti-Semitism. And I'm Jewish myself, and there has been a rise in anti-Semitism in our country. In fact, a white supremacist tried to burn down my synagogue. We have not been in our sanctuary for a year and a half, my family in Austin. So I am not denying the existence of anti-Semitism. But a lot of what we're hearing on campus from students and others is criticism of Israel, which I might actually disagree with, but it's not anti-Semitic. But it is politically useful for certain people in this state to jump up and down and say, we're defending Israel, and we're not going to let people say things like this, and calling the criticisms they don't like, which are often made by people on the left politically, calling that anti-Semitic and trying to show and earn their conservative bona fides by criticizing that.
Was the university police department, were they surprised that the city, what was Austin police brought in, or
Yes, so on April 24th and April 29th, not only were campus police and Austin police brought to campus, which seems appropriate to me if there's even a concern of disruption, but the Department of Public Safety, the state police, were brought on campus. And on April 24th, I was there.
And they're not the ones, if I may say, who really have the training and how to handle this type of situation.
No, we had more than 100 DPS, Department of Public Safety officers, brought from Houston to Austin, to our campus.
So who made that decision?
So they were officially requested by the president, but the president of the university said he was under pressure. And what was most horrifying to me, I must say, is the police officers, everything I saw, they followed the rules. They were polite. I have no criticism. I have high regard for police officers. They're putting their lives on the line every day for us. But what was striking to me was the ways in which certain politicians and university leaders were triumphing and bragging that they had brought the police in. That this
Did you
was a
see
good
this
moment.
firsthand?
Yes. And I think it was politically useful to tell people far from campus, look how tough I am. I'm bringing in the police. I'm putting down these angry left-wing protesters that you don't like. And those politics worry me.
I think it's also notable that in the situation at UT Austin that Jeremy's just speaking to, that all the dozens of protesters that were arrested the same day, the Travis County attorney dismissed all the charges against them, and I think
Which
it's a
we've seen
reflection.
happen, elsewhere around the country.
It's a reflection, I think, in my opinion, that to prosecute those particular students on those charges would be difficult because they would assert a First Amendment defense
precisely.
that they were lawfully exercising their right to protest and right to free speech, and that they hadn't crossed these lines.
Where it's really complicated for those of us on university campuses like myself, I think we all agree here that free speech is the lifeblood of democracy and the lifeblood of intellectual work. I love being on a college campus because I love being around people of different points of view. And we have been buffeted back and forth at the university because for a number of years we've been criticized, I think, with some legitimacy.
And again, are you saying UT? Or
UT and I think the world of universities, our peers, top universities, public and private, have been criticized from the outside, I think appropriately, because there weren't enough conservative viewpoints that were heard on campus. There tends to be a certain bias. People, especially in the liberal arts, in my field, tend to go into this, with a particular point of view, just as those in business schools have a particular point of view. And we were criticized by, including the governor of Texas, for not having enough conservative viewpoints, and we were told to encourage more free speech. And in fact, we were prohibited by a state law in 2019, a state law that now says we cannot kick someone off of campus, even if they're not a student, for expressing their viewpoint. So you have a right to protest at the UT
that's at the
campus.
public university, but
Exactly. And so this law was passed by the Texas legislature 5 years ago, as Jeremy was saying, and it was...
they may like to withdraw it now, right?
Well, the impetus of it was there was a viewpoint amongst some elected leaders that conservative viewpoints were being shut out, that they didn't have the opportunity to exercise their right of free speech, and that the university was turning a cold shoulder to their exercise of free speech. So that was addressed through legislation that said, well, our public universities statewide, not just the University of Texas at Austin, but statewide, are now considered traditional free speech zones. And any member of the community, just as Jeremy was saying, can come onto campus to exercise their right of free speech.
That's what free speech should be. But now the same people who passed that law are condemning the university because we're allowing students I disagree with, but I defend their right to speak. We're allowing them to make the case for a free Palestine. They're criticizing us for the same legislators.
So when I was driving here to the studio this morning, I thought about this. You teach political science. If a student walks in wearing a keffiyeh, is that okay?
Of course.
What about a professor who's teaching mathematics, computer science, and is wearing a keffiyeh?
Of course, they can.
But doesn't that, I hate this word, trigger, but I mean, if you are a Jewish student and you're there studying computer science and the professor walks in clearly showing his political views.
So long as he's not grading you down or preventing you from doing your work, I'm going to say the same thing that those to the right of me often say, right? In another context, you got to get over it. You've got to be in an environment where you learn to be around people with different points of view.
Paul, do you agree?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think now we're kind of crossing over to questions of academic freedom, which are different from First
Good, I
Amendment
wanted to do
principles.
that.
Yes, but they're just sort of very much intertwined with free speech issues as well. But generally speaking, the concept of academic freedom is that members of the academy have a right of freedom in what they research, what they write about, what they teach about. But the limits of that can be, or generally considered to be, doesn't mean that gives you a platform as a math professor to talk about, to advocate your point of view over Hamas. If it's extraneous to the actual subject that you're teaching, then maybe that can be regulated, or your right to speak to those issues.
You're okay with wearing
but
a
the pure
symbol
expressive,
or...
yes, something like that. I mean, like flags, garments, that sort of thing. That's a very traditional area that's recognized as expressive speech.
I mean, we could put
protected.
it in a different context, right? You can wear a big cross if you want. I mean, I'm
Yes.
Jewish. I don't wear a cross. I'm not necessarily comfortable around people wearing big crosses. Yeah. But if you're a math professor and that's what you believe, and
Right.
it's important to you personally while you're teaching to have a big cross on, why not?
Are students too sensitive now? Are you seeing a change?
You know, it's so interesting. I do think students are too sensitive, but I also think there are too many people outside the university that are exploiting their own sensitivities. And so I'm seeing as much of that on the right as on the left. Again, the people who were telling us that we were too quick to see microaggressions and racism in 2019, 2020 are now shouting that every criticism that they see is anti-Semitic and should be repressed on our campus. The same people.
It's a reflection also, I think, of that we've been conditioned over these last decade or so to be outraged and
Yes.
be prepared, and particularly through social media, to be prepared and giving license to express our outrage over things that occurred. And so I think sometimes people express outrage over what they see in a classroom when it's really protected activity. Yeah. Other times when it's more serious, when it's actually harassment of individuals or targeting people for their particular religious affiliations or beliefs, that's different, and that's something that universities can and should regulate.
And just building on what Paul said so well, I think not only are we conditioned to be outraged, we're conditioned to be partisan. Which side are you on? I've been talking to a lot of both Jewish and Arab students at UT. And what I find is they're very quick to judge what someone else does or says without actually listening or looking at it.
And if you've been successful, because I know you like to engage in conversation and bring people together, have you or some of your colleagues at UT really worked, and have you had any success in getting students on not just this issue of Gaza and Israel, but other issues to really talk and not just read the bullet points?
I think we have. But I think it has to be in a controlled environment, which is to say it has to be in a classroom environment or something like that, and with a small group. It's very hard when you have a large group of individuals. So where I think I've been most successful is in my seminars or when we organize events. We organized a number of events through the history department where we had evening conversations, but we closed those to the public. Students, faculty, and staff were invited, not because we didn't want the public there, and there were a few people from the public who came, but because the idea was not to have a performance. This was not to be a place where you showed up to tell us what you thought, but for us to actually talk and learn. Students are actually open to that, quite frankly, when we get them out of a public environment, and if I might say so, when we get them away from their parents. They're so politicized by their parents today.
Really?
Absolutely.
And is that a change now?
I do think so. I think it's been an issue for a while, but I think it's gotten worse. Some of it is because, again, of the world of social media and helicopter parenting.
For sure.
But I think also it's a problem of high tuition, because so many families feel they're
giving up so much.
They're giving. I understand where they're coming from. I empathize with that. I'm giving up so much, and they're so concerned about the future of their students and the debt that they're taking on, that to get them to take the risk to listen and be around people who look different and think differently, and to maybe have yourself recorded in that context, right? You never know who's recording on your phone, right? That risk-taking, which is necessary for intellectual discourse, it's hard for some people.
At UT, do you feel that a lot of the protests have been supported or counter-protests by outside parties beyond the academic village?
Yes, but I also think most of what we've seen has come from inside. I don't think there's an outside group controlling things. There aren't puppeteers outside, but there are outside influences that encourage things, both rhetorically and financially. And so there has been a push from powerful groups to encourage the outing of anti-Semitism and encourage criticism of those on the left and wokeness as they see it. But there's also been organized activity from outside campus to bring forth certain progressive points of view. But I don't think that's what's driving things. That's supporting dynamics that are already on campus.
Why do you think this issue has captured campuses in a very different way than so many other controversial topics around our country?
Well, it's such an extreme case of, violence and eruption of warfare in a place that, at least before October 7th, was nominally at peace. I mean, there was a ceasefire in place October 7th, if you will, and now there's terrible things have happened. I mean, Israelis suffered terrorist atrocities, and now they're exercising their right of self-defense, and many civilians have died. It's just a distressing thing for all of us, and I think students tend to react strongly about those things.
Professor Suri, what are we going to see in September?
Well, I'm hoping we're going to see a calmer environment. I hope we're going to see students come back to campus in an environment where we're all committed, after spending months talking about this, to actually create an environment for conversation. I think it's important for universities not only to try to build programming around that, but to make that clear from the start, that we're encouraging free speech, but we're encouraging conversation, not disruption. And explaining just what
that is a very good way to end this program.
Yes.
Conversation, talking, and not disruption. I want to thank you both for being with us. Fascinating discussion.
Thank you for inviting.
And as we've heard, the campus protests over the war in Gaza are testing our institutions of higher learning as they have probably not been tested since the Vietnam War. While universities are justified in expecting that the protests remain within certain norms, we should not lose sight of the fact that the First Amendment is an essential foundation of our democracy, which gives citizens great freedom and latitude to express our views. But as we discussed, it also expects of all of us certain responsibilities which we may find to be uncomfortable, including that we be receptive, even tolerate opinions that run counter to our beliefs, and may even be abhorrent. Thank you once again for being a part of our program where we talk about things that matter with people who care.